My name is Lord Flowers, Brian Flowers, and I was rector here from 1973 till 1985.
What for you makes Imperial special?
Its staff and its students, and of course its mix of subjects, which in my day was almost entirely science and technology, with quite a strong emphasis on engineering. It's broadened out since then with medicine and so on. But we always had connections with medicine through Alan Swanson and people who worked on bioengineering, as it's nowadays called. So the way was set in a way for these other developments. And of course we had the beginnings of management here too in those days. But it was a very heavily science and technology based institution. And that gave it a coherence which many institutions lack.
And it was the staff in those faculties that made it what it is for you?
Yes, indeed, although I should say, because I'm sure it will be in the records, that I arrived here after having been chief executive of the Science Research Council, as it was then called, which was the major research council funding research in universities. And therefore I had a very clear overview of Imperial College and its inner workings and its strengths and weaknesses and how it compared with other institutions and so on and so forth, and of the individuals who applied for grants to the Science Research Council, of course. And when I came, I started a bit of a campaign, not too gently, saying that you're good, but you're not as good as you think you are. And our first step has got to be to bring the standards up to what you would like them to be. I wasn't uniformly liked for that, but nevertheless it was the beginnings, I believe, of the preeminence which Imperial now has.
In this post then, you actually had already an idea of what you might do and how college was perceived by external bodies.
Very much so, yes.
So do you think Imperial still retains that magic that you felt?
Well, of course, I don't see it from the inside in the same way, but reading about it in the press and so on, and talking to the few people that I know nowadays who are here, I get the impression that it very, very much so, that it's kept its magic and indeed has expanded it.
How did it feel to be in charge of this world-renowned organisation?
Well, it was an enormous privilege. It was also a very heavy duty. I believed that my job in leading the institution was to appoint the leaders of it. And so, because if I could appoint those correctly, they would look after the running of the institution in the broader sense, from top to bottom. So I took enormous care appointing heads of departments. When I came in, it was expected of me to be a strong rector in accordance with the traditions of the college. Indeed, I spent a few months learning what everybody thought needed to be done and going around talking to everybody all over the place, staff, professors, students, the lot. And after a few months, a delegation of professors came to see me and said, Rector, we know what you're doing, but please make up your mind what you want us to do and tell us, and we'll do it. This was not the sort of institution I had been used to. But I did come to the conclusion that my chief function as rector had to be to look after the leadership of the college. I couldn't lead the college myself, so I had to delegate to others that task. And in my mind, delegation meant that I was giving my powers of running the college to other people and expecting them to carry it out according to my wishes. As far as I don't mean this as if I'm a dictator. I mean it in the sense of consultation, of course. But they're acting on behalf of the rector. And so I took enormous care appointing, first of all, heads of departments, who in the college were and still are very important people, although you don't call them departments anymore, but various other strange things. And I also took enormous amount of trouble appointing professors. And I think I can say that until I fell ill in my last year, I had the major hand in appointing every professor that was appointed during my 12 years as rector. With others, of course, but I would take the lead. So in this way, I managed to impose some sort of coherence on the institution, which I don't believe it had had, at any rate, to anything like the same extent before.
So this was one of the major changes you wished to make during your term?
Well, it was one of the major changes I felt I had to make early on, and I continued it all the way through, that one. Another major change that I foresaw the need of from my experience of the Science Research Council was the coming importance of what is now called interdisciplinary research and teaching also, for that matter. And we had sponsored quite a bit of that at the Science Research Council. And when I came, I started looking for opportunities to encourage people here to do things. And there were some things already. I mentioned bioengineering and Ellen Swanson already. And there were quite a few other things like that. But my real opportunity occurred some years into my rectorship, about halfway through, I suppose, when, due to experience I had had as chairman of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, and the general tenor of opinion in the scientific world and the public at large, environmental issues were coming to the fore. And the college had some hand in that, of course, because it was very strong in geology in those days and in biology of various sorts. And so in a disorganized way, it was dealing with lots of bits of environmental things, but not as a coherent whole. And I was not in the least bit impressed with the efforts of a number of other universities that had set up departments or even schools of environmental science. I don't believe there is anything called environmental science except a hodgepodge of various proper sciences. But I also came to the conclusion that there was such a thing as environmental technology, at least there ought to be, by which I meant technological approaches to solving environmental problems, practical problems. And gradually there came about the Centre for Environmental Technology, which is now also called something different. I can't remember what. But that flourished, and in particular set up an exceedingly good MSc program, which developed from almost nothing to start with to something quite strong, which has lasted to this day. And in the wake of that, there developed a number of other interdisciplinary activities, one or two of which I had a bit of a hand in, and more not, because most of them have happened in Eric Ash's time and since. But that, I think, was the start of it. And I thought I had done something important there. to justify my having come from the Science Research Council.
So those foundations that you laid, you did feel had been built on?
Oh, definitely, yes. I think in almost all respects the things I tried to do have been built on and have been very considerably extended in some cases. I mean, the links with medicine, of course, are the outstanding one nowadays.
You might also think of the bioengineering, the development in that into a department, and the type of research that was done with electrical engineering that Dick Kitney did and that.
With Bruce Sayers.
Yes.
Yes, well, those are things that had started but have continued and have grown bigger. And I'm delighted to see that. I think it was a very natural development of science and technology in a place like this. And I'm very glad it's all coming about.
We've discussed a little about how you saw the college before you came, because you'd had the overview. How do you think college was seen by the outside world, other academics, politicians, schools, governments?
Not as well as it thought it deserved, which was the reason that when I came in, I told people here frankly that they weren't as good as they thought they were, although they were good, and we could build on it and make it the sort of place that they wanted it to be. But the thought of saying that Imperial College is in the first three with Oxford and Cambridge in those days was ridiculous. It just wasn't, although it had some very hot spots.
What were the hot spots, do you think?
Oh, some of this and some of that. I wouldn't pick out anything in particular, I don't think. But nowadays, of course, it is entirely taken for granted by everyone that Imperial is in the first three.
Well, as you said, it's the foundations you laid which have been built on to keep it there, really.
I think the people who came after me made some contributions of their own, you know. I'm not taking the credit for it all.
No, I'm sure you're not. How did you think at the time that college was seen internally? Well, you've mentioned that the staff thought that they were, perhaps everyone thought we were better than we were. And how did the alumni view college?
The alumni, frankly, were a bit of a pest. I mean, it's very nice to have alumni who have spent some years here and feel a certain loyalty to the place and come along and join you for parties and have a jolly time and all that sort of thing. But alumni of Imperial in those days, and indeed of most universities, seemed to see their role as either just having a good time, which is okay, or making sure that nothing changes. And that was preeminently the role seen for itself by the Imperial College alumni. They resisted any change. I hope that is not the case now. But it is common experience among most universities that used to be the attitude. And of course, as long as that remains the attitude, then it is impossible to get the heavy financial backing of alumni for the activities of the college or the university now and in the future that you're aiming for today. So the first thing that had to be done, and I never succeeded in doing it, but I think the first steps have now been taken, is to change the whole mental and philosophical and emotional attitude of the alumni towards what their role in the college is and should be, to make it more like the American system, where there is no doubt of the support of the alumni for future activities which were not there in that time. Well, that's happening. But it was a very definite weakness in the college when I arrived and throughout my time. And it was a weakness shared by most universities.
Can you describe your perceptions of the college when you took up the post? You've done that up to a point, but when you had the external view from when you were in charge of the Research Council, so when you got here, did you change your view, or was it developed in any way?
No, I didn't change my view. I got to know many, many more incumbents of Imperial College than I had known before, of course. And they were a very likeable bunch of people, a very, very clever bunch of people too. And I greatly enjoyed being with them straight away. And indeed, I never looked back on that point of view.
Did you miss Imperial when you left?
Enormously. Being rector of Imperial College is the top of my career, and I said so at the time. It didn't matter what happened to me later on, that was still the case, and it is.
So does anything stand out in your memory about your time as rector here? It can be very small, but something that, you know, has an impact on you or on Lady Flowers?
Well, living in 170 was something that one can never forget, especially if one had grandchildren who lived here too. And no doubt my wife will say a few words about that. But it was a great place to be. As far as the grandchildren were concerned, the college was known as Grandpa's Tower. That was the Queen's Tower, which was known as Grandpa's Tower to them. And that shows the sort of devotion of the whole family, I suppose, towards Imperial, the way we felt about it. And it was a tremendous pleasure and honour to live in this place and be in such an important role in it.
So you very much involved your family in your job, in a way?
Well, it didn't involve the grandchildren, although they played around. And there was one famous occasion when I was sitting in the council meeting with all those important people sitting around the table, and the door opened and in came my little granddaughter with a bare bottom and went straight for me and sat on my knee. So I had to wriggle out of that one. I wouldn't call that a contribution to running the college exactly, but Mary, my wife, played quite a big part in doing so. She will speak for herself later, no doubt, but she was very much concerned with student affairs and with the creation, things like that. No, there is one thing perhaps I should say, and that is that from my position as a member of the CBCP, the old, what is now UK universities, of which I became chairman at a certain stage. From my position now, I was very concerned, of course, about the input into politics that the universities had, and also the influence of politics on the universities. And seen from both directions, and of course I did see it from both directions eventually because I became a peer. And talked from both points of view. But it became clear to me that Imperial College's efforts could be harnessed to the efforts of Parliament to try to understand what science and technology was all about. And so I encouraged members of staff, mainly professors, to take part in select committee investigations and things like that, make themselves generally helpful and available to MPs who wanted to ask questions. And I said to members of the House of Commons, look, you've got Imperial College on your doorstep, regarded as your institution. Come in and look at it and enjoy it and ask questions. And that did develop slowly. A relationship which I think continues to this day, judging by people I meet in select committees and things. So that I think was quite an important initiative which came about from my connections with other activities. That's something else I should say, I suppose. I've mentioned my connections in the CVCP with the universities in general. I've mentioned my connection with the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. I was also the first president of the European Science Foundation, which is a body which brings together all the research councils and many of the academies of the whole of Western Europe, including much of Eastern Europe these days. So I spent quite a fraction of my time outside the college doing other things, but they were all things that brought to me, and I hope to those I interacted with, a broader view of the role of science and technology in human affairs. I think Imperial gained from it. I certainly did. And many people here were certainly interested in what I was up to in various fields and used to talk rather enthusiastically about it. So I reckon it did more good than harm.
You mentioned alumni. How were your relationships with the students when you were rector?
Well, I was very keen that we should have very good social and working relationships with the students, particularly with the Students' Union, because they influence what the student body thinks to such an extent. And so I had regular meetings with them, and we had them in at home and so on. But we also had students into the flat, the rector's flat, in droves. And Mary was responsible for that, together with the Imperial College Wives Club. So when I came home from work on the days of one of these parties, at which we served beer and bangers, I found the kitchen full of college wives, and Mary bustling around organising it all. But she should speak about this.
Well, yes, I felt it was very important that we should get to know the students. And we used to have twice termly beer and bangers parties. And I must say they were marvellous, because you can imagine the mess when they'd gone. But a few of them used to come up to me and say, well, where's the Hoover? And they'd clean up after themselves. But as I said, we found the sausages were going rather fast. And I had to keep on sending down to the kitchen for more. And I couldn't think, you know, I'd allowed about eight per capita, and that's a hell of a lot of sausages. Then I realised that there was a competition afoot as to who could sink the most sausages. Then we got wise to that and found the culprits and rationed them. But no, on the whole, they were marvellous. And as Brian has said, we had our grandchildren here an awful lot. And I mean, they were falling over themselves to babysit. So I never lacked for help of that sort. Trevor Phillips.
Trevor Phillips was president of the union part of our time here, and our young grandson, Marcus, used to call him Uncle Trevor. And Uncle Trevor, he has remained in our family ever since. I mean, we'd given beer and bangers parties twice a term for 12 years, pretty well non-stop, if I remember rightly. And when we left, it was a very appropriate but a terribly nice gesture that the Students' Union decided to throw a beer and bangers party for us on the Queen's lawn. And this was a great occasion. The high spot of which for me wasn't the beer and bangers, but the fact that they decided to take me on a tour of Hyde Park and Park Lane and back along Knightsbridge on Bow. And this we carried out to the considerable consternation of the police, who fortunately had a sense of humour and rubbed their eyes in disbelief and then waved us on. And that was a great and jolly occasion a few days before we actually left the college.
And did
But a
you,
very nice gesture on the part of the students.
Mary, did you had an experience with Bow?
Oh, yes, I drove it. Very badly, I'm afraid. I went over some flower beds. We better draw a veil over that because I was not used to changing gear outside the car.
Do you want to say anything about the Wives' Club?
Oh, yes. Well, I inherited the Wives' Club, and it was all very proper. It was all Mrs. this and Mrs. that, and Lady this and Lady that. So I said, look, we've all got names, why don't we use them? And also, at that time, it was an era of financial stringency. And so I thought we'd better raise some money, particularly for the day nursery. The day nursery was in imminent danger of being closed. Now, if we lose the daycare centre, we lose our clever girls. So we started on a fundraising basis. A lot of people were a bit snooty about it, thought we shouldn't be doing that, but we pressed ahead and we did a number of things. I had 3 fashion shows. Joanne Brogden was Professor of Fashion at the Royal College of Art, and she supplied the clothes, and the students modelled them. Then we had, we produced a recipe book. Everybody contributed a recipe, and one of the students illustrated.
Me?
Yes, you did, Noel. Your punch.
I put in my punch, yes.
It was bark is worse than its bite. And there's a copy of it in the archives.
It was a very good punch for giving to students because it tasted absolute murder, but there was hardly any alcohol in it. The secret was to use a little black navy rum, which smelt to high heaven, but didn't actually contribute very much to their drunkenness.
And we had all sorts of fundraising parties, and we did the cooking ourselves. Everybody brought something, and so and we had so much fun. I mean, it was a very, very happy time.
But you also looked after the creche.
Yes. We gave our funds to the day nursery, and it enabled us to take care, to some extent, of their capital expenditure, because they got enough for running costs, but when it came to a broken down washing machine or some new furniture, that's where we tried to step in and help. And I'm thankful to say that the day nursery is now flourishing. So I gather.
It is. So between you work very closely with the students and in support of the students, because if you think of the day nursery.
Yes. Also the disabled students. I carried out a pilot scheme with a very, very nice young man who was wheelchair bound with a great sense of humour.
Student.
And I said, would you just take a trip round the college and tell me what you can't get into? Well, the first and most obvious thing was he couldn't get into the health centre because it was a listed building and they wouldn't put a ramp there. I said, this is ridiculous. And he said, why? Whatever the matter with me. But we did in the end. We managed to get the planning authorities to relax their rules a little bit so that access was made a bit easier, but that was just a sort of...
But this all reminds me of something that I certainly should have mentioned to you. About halfway through my rectorship came the first of the government cuts, which were all pretty drastic, and they got worse and worse. And indeed, I had more or less secretly decided that I intended to leave the college after 7 or 8 years. In fact, I stayed for 12, and the reason for that was that in about my 6th year, I suppose it must have been, these cuts arrived. And I really felt that I had to stay and see the college through the difficult times that clearly lay ahead for some while. And in fact, I stayed for 12 years. And well, I did my best to help the college with its problems, but the cuts didn't cease with me leaving, unfortunately. They went on. And they went on until gradually a new attitude towards the funding of universities arrived, and is arriving still, and will only be solved when every student pays for his own fees in full, and there is no dependence on government money anymore. For research, yes, but not for teaching.
How do you see that affecting?
Sorry?
How do you see that affecting universities and students?
Well, it will produce some inequalities, obviously. I don't shrink from inequalities because I think there are inequalities, and one has to make sure that they don't cause damage, and one has to do one's best to help it to dissolve. So, I mean, although people who can afford it should pay their full fees, I'm talking about a system in which that is the norm, of course, not now. But at the same time, one has to set up suitable arrangements for funding in part or even in whole the fees of students who really can't afford it. Some of them being just as clever as those who can, if not more so. One must know an institution like Imperial College should never cut itself off from people, good people, on the trivial grounds that they're poor. It's absurd. So it has got to find a way of generating the money to support such people. And that inevitably means a tax on those who can't afford to pay. So, I mean, this is the system that we are gradually moving towards. Some people don't like it. A lot of people don't like it. Many students don't like it because the idea of building up debt is anathema to them. One doesn't go into debt in the great British way of looking at things. But of course, debt is something that is part of the financial system we live in these days. And so, as long as you can manage the debt and see a way of paying it off in due course, and provided it doesn't fall unfairly on you, so that, for instance, you're not expected to pay it all off in your first year out of work, which would be absurd, but instead pay according to your current means when you're working. Things like that. I think it's all right, and the student body's simply got to get used to living that way, as they have done in the States for a long time. And it's only in those circumstances that the fully world-class universities can develop. And that is why they've developed to a considerably greater extent in the States than they have here.
But in your time here, that wasn't the ethos. Do you think there's a change in the mindset of the students that you have to deal with then and now? I mean, you're still involved in universities.
Well, I find it a bit difficult to answer because I'm not in touch with students anymore. So I don't know what their innermost thoughts are in the way that I used to. But, I mean, something that was obvious to me even in my time is that student memories last for 3 years. And when a new student body comes in, it's a new union. It's a new everything, and the problems that students claim they face change year by year, according to the whims of the, I shouldn't say whims, but according to the vision of the officers, of the elected officers of the union, who are there for 1 year. And after 3 years, or 4 years these days, all the students have gone and been replaced by others. So, fortunately, unlike the alumni, opinion can change much more rapidly. As I say, I don't know what student opinion is nowadays, but more and more students are getting used to the idea that they have to contribute towards their fees, and do so apparently happily. One hears the occasional grumble about those who find an intolerable burden of debt looming. That is because they haven't learned how to manage it and haven't seen the essence of debt and its orderly repayment.
Do you think that's something that universities and Imperial should be trying to teach students?
Yes, I do, actually. I do. I don't think it requires a full 3-year course or anything, but I think a couple of lectures or so to incoming students about managing their affairs, and the odd pamphlet or two and that sort of thing. Maybe there are pamphlets, I don't know. Would be a very good thing.
This was not something the students complained about in your day?
No, the problem didn't arise in my day.
What did they complain to you about in your day?
Oh, they complained, of course, because the grants were too low. Which in a way is a similar thing, but because if the grant really is too low, they have to spend their own money. And although it's not contributing to the fees, it's contributing to their livelihood. There are things I was much too discreet to say that they could do, like drink less beer.
Well, unless you were supplying it at the parties, of course.
Unless we were supplying it, yes. And perhaps they couldn't afford to buy sausages, which would explain sausage competitions that we used to have.
From the point of view of family life, it was a marvellous place to live. I mean, Brown worked terribly, terribly hard. He worked all the hours, godsend. I didn't exactly sit around and twiddle my thumbs, but it was just about the happiest time of our working life, those 12 years at Imperial. It really was. Everyone was so friendly, so cooperative, and there just wasn't a soul that wasn't on a friendly basis with us. You know, they always, from students, staff, anyone, they always knew they could drop in, a cup of tea in the kitchen and a chat about their personal affairs. We tried to make ourselves available.